One of the great heroic characters that we look to in history that stood alone, defiant against the grim specter of Nazi Germany was Winston Churchill. And England was all alone. I mean, they were watching all of Europe gobble up. I mean, what was years of the Maginot Line between France and Germany was just boom, blitzkrieg right over. Nothing could stop Hitler's machine. The Wehrmacht was marching on. But Churchill would not back down. He was the indispensable man. And for a year before the United States got in the war because of Pearl Harbor, he stood totally alone on a razor's edge, like 40, 50 nights of bombing from England every night. But he took it, and then he brought them into victory. Now let's take a look at the man that saved perhaps the world from the tyranny of Nazi Germany, Winston Churchill.
Clean, safe water. It's the foundation of a healthy home, but hidden contaminants could be putting your family at risk. That's why there's Sentry H2O, the smarter way to protect what matters most. It filters out what doesn't belong and restores what your body needs. Pure, mineral-rich water that tastes as fresh as it is clean. Because your family deserves more than just clean. They deserve water that supports their health. Go to lancewallnau.com/water and use code LANCE to save 10% on your water wellness system. That's lancewallnau.com/water, code LANCE.
One of the interesting things that I've noticed in the pantheon of great leaders, such as Churchill, we're going to talk about, is that for people of faith, you wonder, well, what's going on during history when you don't see God conspicuously at work? Well, there's a book in the Bible called the Book of Esther. Interesting book. It almost was thrown out of the canon of Scripture because God's name isn't mentioned once. The name of Yahweh, Jehovah, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not mentioned. But years after the wise scholars that included it in the canon of Scripture, years later, they started utilizing some techniques with looking at the analysis of the Hebrew documents that form the book of Esther, and they found that hidden within the first letters, as often happens in certain Bible, like Psalm 119 in the Bible, that there are words that spell something out, and they found the name of God, Yahweh, written, hidden in the code of the book, and front and backwards, different parts of the book revealed God's name, communicated. God, in providence, God moves. His invisible hand comes down and is seen by visible events. As with Churchill, there were many great Christians and believers who were evangelicals. Rees Howells, the intercessor, Smith Wigglesworth. That's from my charismatic and evangelical perspective. These were historic figures in Britain that were praying as they watched Hitler rising and stomping through Europe. And their prayers were answered by the hand of providence. In the same way that I will say, and as I predicted in 2015 and stand behind now, Donald Trump is such a hand of providence vessel. God raises up. And God raises up these unique characters that are forged in a different arena than the political arena or than the theological arena. But yet they come into a period of time where they were built in secret for the work they have to do. I've showed that hopefully to some degree with Lincoln when we talked about him earlier. And with Churchill, my first recollection of him being a unique character in history was from a quote from John Kennedy when I was younger. Never quite forgot what he said. He said, "In the dark days and darker nights when England stood alone and most men, save the Englishmen, despaired of England's life, Churchill mobilized the English language and sent it into battle." Churchill mobilized the English language and sent it into battle. And it's true. His speeches and his perspective was what clarified, in a sense, prophetically inspired and infused a will to fight. And if you ever see any of the great movies that are out, that have come out in the last couple of years, with Gary Oldman particularly, it shows that Churchill almost wasn't in office, and that the leaders that were there, from Neville Chamberlain on down, that they would have caved. They did not have what it took. They were willing to negotiate with the Nazis for some form of peaceful coexistence, even if it meant that they would have to surrender their sovereignty. But not Churchill. He was unique in history in the same way that I think Donald Trump is unique in history, who the one man for that moment who could stand against the tide. Now, what makes an individual like that important? When history goes dark, God raises up a voice to defy fear, to expose the lies, and to rally the weary to a renewed sense of warfare and overcoming. So let me go down into Hitler. Yes, let's talk about Hitler, one of my favorite leaders of the last 100 years. Now, Churchill had a family dynamic I want to talk about. And I had to dig this one up because I thought psychologically, like I looked for what's different. There's a lot of material on Churchill. I'm interested in what's different that I can share with you that you haven't really thought about. Well, here's what I want you to think about. What's the role your parents play in your formation as a child? I say it's pretty significant. In Lincoln's case, we never talked about this, but it was his mother who loved him and saw something. His dad was evidently a real jerk. He didn't like him that much. Not very close to his father. Not real nice. His mom, I think, died, and the man remarried, I guess, and the second wife was the one who particularly was fond of Abe. And so it was his mother that encouraged him and gave him the nurture that the gruff, cold, distant, and detached father didn't give his gifted young son. Churchill had a similar experience. I want you to think about your own family of origin. He had a difficult relationship with his father, Lord Randolph, a nobility and a figure of great renown. And Lord Randolph regarded young Winston as a disappointment. And worse yet, he articulated the fact that he figured his kid was going to be a failure. Churchill once wrote, "He told me that I would never amount to anything and that I should be a disgrace to him and to my family." You'll never amount to anything and be a disgrace to all of us. I'd like to have that. If you want to have a victim narrative over your head, my father told me I'd never amount to anything. Despite this, he longed for his father's approval. And here's the quote I want you to get. I don't know if I've got those quotes here. But he wrote of his father, he died at 45, and I've always felt that I was robbed of a great companion. His father died at 45, and guess what? He never saw his son step into what he could ultimately be proud of. Kind of a tragedy, isn't it? In contrast, his mother, Jenny, who was American and quite an attractive lady at that, believed deeply in young Winston's potential, and she poured confidence into him at a young age. "Oh, Winston, you're so gifted. Winston, you're so smart. Winston, you're so funny. She shone for me like the evening star," he wrote. "I loved her beauty. I loved her dearly. But I did it at a distance. She was like a fairy princess, a radiant being possessed of limitless riches and power. Kind of idolized Mommy, and Mommy thought he was great. But I guess back then they kind of sent you away to Edinburgh and all the schools and the prep schools and all that stuff. So you didn't really have a chance to have those family vacations where you all get to know each other like we do in America. But her encouragement shaped the boldness and persistence that ended up defining his public persona. The point being, and I'm laboring to make it, is you don't need anyone's approval to succeed. But it's helpful to have just one voice that believes enough in you to light your fire. Typically, if it isn't a mom, it's a dad. If it's not a dad, it's a mom. If it's not that, it's a sibling, it's a brother or sister. If it's not that, teachers are the great vehicle that can speak to a child's potential. So, like Lincoln, Churchill dealt with depression. He called it the black dog. He privately described his reoccurring depression as the black dog. He experienced deep emotional lows. Sometimes suicidal thoughts raced through his brain, especially during periods of isolation and public failure. Remember his dad's voice, "You're going to be a disgrace." But he never gave in. Instead, he developed the mental discipline to manage the pressure. At Chartwell, which was his home, his special location that he retreated to, he found therapy during his period of being rejected and abandoned by his own country before the Second World War, by painting and by building stone walls by hand himself, and not always perfectly straight, and by laying bricks. He found there was a therapy in physical exertion of doing something. Now, what triggered the depression? He was raised to a very high, prestigious role in the First World War as First Lord of the Admiralty, kind of like Pete Hegseth type role with the Department of Defense. And since England is a maritime power, projecting its strength through the oceans rather than land, primarily, being in charge of the Admiralty was a big deal. But Churchill had come up with an idea for a military maneuver in the First World War in a place called the Dardanelles that failed. There's much going back and forth as to whether it was his failure or a failure of execution on someone else's part, but it was a catastrophe militarily, and it caused the death of tens of thousands of British in Tripoli. As a result, he had to step out of his role and, frankly, deal with the voice of his father, who said, "You'll be an embarrassment to us." And that's what he felt. After the First World War, he ended up retiring to a great degree from public life. His party bounced back and forth from his party to the competing party. And he had great debts, financial pressure, so he had to take to writing history and writing for papers. And it helped to sharpen his brain and his mind and his understanding as he began writing. But as Hitler rose to power, he had a unique realization that he alone understood the threat of Nazi Germany better than others. And he rallied together what he called his shadow cabinet of experts in munitions and war manufacturing. And they engaged in a kind of spying statecraft. They were like a wholesome deep state. And they brought back to him reports of how the armaments were going in Germany and what the British response was and how much they were spending and how far behind they were. So he became armed to the teeth and ready to lead, and the nation would turn to him and say, "We need Winston." We'll be back in a moment. We'll talk about that. I wanted to take a minute to talk about one of my great heroes of the faith, which is Mike Lindell. What's really cool about Mike is it's not just the pillow. It's the fact that the guy makes really cool products. For instance, I start my day off with my coffee. I had a cup of coffee the other day here in the office, and I said, "No, I want that." It wasn't like Starbucks. It tastes better. And it was Mike's coffee. I said, "What is it?" They go, "Mike Lindell's coffee." I said, "My gosh, get a bunch of my coffees." Now, the best way to start the day is you put on these slippers, right? And have your My Coffee. If you've not worked with these slippers yet, I'm not kidding you. There's a special kind of a design that Mike has put into these with 4 layers of cushion with a solid sole and a fur interior. I call it my sip and slip strategy. I start my day off by slipping on my slippers, then having a sip of Mike's coffee. But you know what else I'm curious about now? Because I've got to check out the 2.0 pillow. The 2.0 pillow actually is designed so that it distributes the heat of your own head, your face. You know, you're lying there, and it It makes it so the pillow's always cool. Now, I like that because I wake up in the middle of the night and have to flip over my pillow because it gets hot. Mites solve that problem. I want you to go to mypillow.com, promo code Lance, because you can get a discount that I've set up for the pillows, for the coffee, and for the slippers. And do it today. You'll be happy. Well, his enemies, Halifax, Neville Chamberlain, the lords of the Admiralty, all of them knew that in the desperation of watching Hitler's blitzkrieg roll across Europe in 1940, they needed Churchill because he was the one who had predicted what was coming. And so they turned to him. And here he was. And he began in a grim moment because, you know, he had to endure the fact that they had no military preparation to face their opposition. But I'll tell you some quotes of quotes of Churchill that prepared him to deal with Hitler. In fact, I want to say something. What's interesting to me is that Adolf Hitler would refer to Churchill, who was out of power, out of office, over at Chartwell, kind of on the backside of the desert, like, you know, John the Baptist waiting for the time of his showing unto Israel. And Hitler didn't talk about Halifax, and Hitler didn't talk about Chamberlain. Hitler didn't talk about King George. Hitler had this demonic sense that his real enemy was Winston Churchill. It's like the demons in him knew Churchill. He was right. Churchill's great quote was, okay, if you're going through hell, just keep going. Last thing you want to do is stop halfway through hell. Now watch the quotes here, because they reveal a lot of the man. The man is a quotable man. To each of us, there comes a time in their life, a special moment when they are tapped on the shoulder and offered the chance to do a very special thing. What a tragedy if that moment finds them unprepared. Man, think about that. I want you to think about that. I want you to think about what incentivizes you. There's a concept in martial arts and in various sciences that's called the plateau. See, a lot of people love a breakthrough, a high, but then they don't like the plateau. But you see, it's the plateau where you keep practicing certain moves and certain disciplines over and over again. It's kind of like in the Karate Kid, wax on, wax off. Daniel, you know, he had to learn that even this mundane repetition on the plateau, practicing certain things, when it came time for combat, boop, 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 it suddenly became muscle memory. The plateau is, frankly, your prayer life, your reading scriptures, this is what I mean as a Christian. I think about this, to do what I do here. Many times, like on a day like this, I literally have to go into the granary of hours that I've spent in reading history or studying something, and boom, bring it out because I have deadlines and I don't have the time to now go do preparation. I have to be prepared and draw out of the well what's already in there. So what Churchill's saying is, what a tragedy if the moment finds you, and because you weren't stimulated by the moment, you miss your moment of preparation. But that whole thing about preparation matches another thing, which is, I really do believe that there's a sense of destiny, a sense of purpose. You got a prophetic call in your life, whether you know what it is or not, it's there. You can ask God to reveal it to you. But this is a great quote from Churchill. I felt all my past life has been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial. What a great quote. This guy's not even an evangelical, and he's got more faith for history working out in his life. He's saying, everything I've gone through, it was the First World War, it was my turn. I didn't even give you the guy's history in Africa in the Boers War, and when he was a prisoner, and he was a journalist, and he broke out and escaped and came back as a kind of a celebrity journalist, and talking about his experience in the Boer War and his battles. I mean, he was a bit like Teddy Roosevelt, you know, with this sense of aggressive, masculine drive and wanting to be where the action is and do something historic and significant and risk his life. And well, he said all of that was a preparation, including the Depression including the failure at the Dardanelles, including dealing with, his obscurity. It prepared me for this trial. Those are great quotes. And that's where we go to, I'll fight. I'm going to fight. It's like Donald Trump. Fight, fight, fight. I'm going to fight them on the land. I'm going to fight them on the beach. We're not giving up. We're not giving in. The other guys didn't have that attitude. Halifax didn't have it. Lord knows Neville Chamberlain, peace in our time, didn't have it. So, though not overtly evangelical, he had a sense of destiny. In fact, one of the quotes I wish I had prepared here, but I didn't give us, maybe we'll bring it up here in post. When he saw the Second World War forming, he met with Roosevelt, and he framed, almost as a theologian, the conflict of Germany versus the rest of the world, Nazism versus Western civilization. And what he said was, upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. And then with the kind of prescient prophetic gift that a leader like that has, he almost spoke to AI right now. What's coming next? I mean, I shudder when I think of what happens as an amoral or a technocratic state takes over the power to control all speech, all image, all communication, and then monitor you in the process. Because he said this haunting phrase, the real threat of Nazi ideology, of fascist dictatorship, is made all the more menacing by the lights of perversions of science, perverted science, or technology in the hands of a terror state, controlling what you think and say and do. Whew. He believed England had a moral destiny to stand against tyranny. And that's why, boy, you would have a Christian nationalist meltdown, panic attack, Tourette's assault, if you were to be with Churchill today. Because you know what he wanted to have played when he met on the Missouri with Franklin Roosevelt in order to discuss their plans for partnership against the Nazis? He insisted that they play "Onward, Christian soldiers, marching as to war with the cross of Jesus." He insisted that they have "Onward, Christian soldiers." He understood in his own way, under the Anglican influence of his faith, that there was an ultimate moral issue and a spiritual battle that was being fought against the sinister forces of Hitler and Nazism. So let me, in the few minutes we have, I've got to give you the human side of Churchill. Not that there's any particular great takeaway other than I hate the fact that you might not know these things. The devil did try to kill him. He was in New York, after meeting with FDR and forming their alliance and speaking to Congress and bringing the Americans up to date on the moral crusade and the toughness of what they were able to do and the hope for what they could accomplish together against Japan, Germany, and Italy. And because they drive on a different part of the street over there in England, he gets out in New York and gets run over by a cab, almost killed. While he's in Washington, he goes to New York in 1931 to get hit by a car. The great quote is, "It's well known that a New York taxi driver has the right of way over everybody, and except for a truck." And so he was run over. In a great moment in the White House, meeting with FDR, and Roosevelt loved Churchill because Roosevelt himself was a bit of a bon vivant. He loved a bit of repartee. He was a cocktail guy and a conversationalist. And, well, Winston would regale him. And the two of these guys be drinking and talking late at night, and kind of developed a kind of a friendship between the two of them, which was very helpful because they had a relationship that backed up the war. But Roosevelt, who of course was invalid, he wheeled up to Churchill's door and kind of like knocked on it, and Churchill didn't hear him. He just kind of opened it and wheeled himself in, and Churchill was in the bathtub. And so Churchill stands up, dripping wet, fully naked, and says to Franklin Roosevelt, "The Prime Minister of Great Britain has nothing to hide from the President of the United States." Of course, this was met by gales of laughter and stories that would be told over and over again, as Franklin couldn't wait to say, "Then I go into Churchill, and there is butt naked in the bathtub," and stands up. But these stories you might as well know. The great classic one is when Lady Astor, a very refined British aristocrat, finds Winston at dinner, and all these dinners they'd have, a bit boring and boorish. And she said, "If you were my husband, I'd poison your tea." To which Churchill replied, "Madam, if I was your husband, I'd actually drink it." And but this was, in all of his public life, he dealt with his critics and he dealt with his enemies with the skill of one who is a combatant. And he was never actually bested by any of them. There's a terrible story about Bessie Braddock. She said, "Winston, you are drunk." And Churchill said, "My dear, you're ugly, but tomorrow I'll be sober." Which you can't get away with that. You couldn't even get away with saying that nowadays. But the reality is Churchill had that kind of a personality. Now, when the war was over, you would think that the nation would reward the man that had saved them by re-electing him as prime minister. But no, he was sadly rubbed out of office. They were tired of Winston. He was kind of like the guy they wanted in war, but not the guy they wanted in peace. And so he had to deal with that. Now, he would eventually, later on, as an old man, be reelected. But the truth is, Churchill had to deal with the fact that destiny required him for those critical 5 years that would determine the survival of Christian civilization in Europe and around the world. And when nobody else was there, he had the grit to stand in the gap because God formed him for that moment, and the prayers of people deployed the right tool at the right time. And I would suggest to you that that same thing happens today, and that we should be looking carefully to see not who agrees with our theology, but who actually has the principles and the ideas and the character to handle tough times. Well, that's my story, and I'm sticking with it. We'll see you again on our next episode.
Did you enjoy this latest episode? Please remember to share it with your friends, because the more knowledge you have,